Before I make some remarks on the state of where we are with high-speed rail and what we need to do with the High-Speed Rail Association and our initiatives, I do want to say two things in expressing my gratitude for the award. First, I couldn't be more honored than to be a recipient of an award named for Governor Jerry Brown. There is no greater advocate for investment in the future than this man. And I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote, which has nothing to do with high-speed rail. I came to California in 1978 to become the Deputy Assistant for Science and Technology, which was a pretty heady title for a guy with a political science degree. But I was doing that working for the governor. And 6 months after I got here, the people of California voted for Proposition 13, which substantially changed the entire funding mechanism for state government. Prior to that time, the guy who brought me to California, a former astronaut, was working with the governor on a communications satellite program specific to California, which was inaccurately called the California Satellite Project. When Prop 13 happened, that was jettisoned because the public mood was such that it just couldn't accept it. About 6 months after that, my boss and I got called to the governor's office. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. 3 of us were in his office. There were no reporters. There was nobody to impress. And Jerry Brown looked at us and said, "I'm putting my budget together. Where's my science and technology initiative?" And we sat there for a moment, and I finally sputtered, and I said, "Governor, we just assumed after Prop 13, there's no appetite for initiatives like that in the state budget." And Jerry Brown chastised me, and I'll never forget what he said. "I don't care if we're down to our last dime. We're going to find a penny to invest in the future. We will not eat our seed corn. We will always invest for the future." And I stood there at that moment and realized that I was in the presence of a very different type of political leader than we see in this country. So it was a deep honor for me that he asked me to assume this role, which is now in a leadership position for the nation's largest infrastructure program, and something that he has stood foursquare behind despite all of the setbacks, legal losses, budgetary increases, and all of that. He's never faltered because he believes in this for the future of the state. He believes this is the kind of investment we need to make, along with investments in water infrastructure, in energy, in education, and so forth. I also would like to take a moment as a point of personal privilege. Rod was kind in mentioning my late wife, Jackie Fanninsteel. She was a remarkable woman. She was the first woman to become an officer of Pacific Gas and Electric Company. It's a 100-year history. She was the first woman to become the chair of the California Energy Commission. She was the first woman to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, in charge of all Navy and Marine bases worldwide, all their energy programs. We moved to Washington in 2010. She was appointed by President Trump, confirmed by the United States Senate, and went to work in the Pentagon, and was doing great work, and then unfortunately, several years in, was diagnosed with cancer. It was about 6 months after the governor had appointed me to high-speed rail, and despite the fact that I thought it was going to be a once-a-month fly out to California for a board meeting, I got here about 10 days later. He started screaming at me that I needed to be on the ground 24/7 making this thing happen. So I was flying back and forth. When Jackie was diagnosed in February of 2012, I looked at her and I said, "All right, I'm here. I'm going to be with you through all this. We've already made a bunch of changes in high-speed rail. I've already kind of moved some things. I'm going to step down from that." And she looked at me and said, "No, that will make me crazy. This is too important. You need to keep doing this." And despite all the things she went through, she wanted me to continue to do this, and I was grateful she was able to survive for 5 years. She was there at the groundbreaking, so this award's for her too. So thank you. Thank you. So I was trying to reflect on what are the appropriate things to say since I've been asked to give an address, a keynote address here. And I wanted to talk about several things that bring us together as advocates for this program, but I think advocates also for something larger. And you've heard a lot of that this morning. People have talked about high-speed rail as part of our broader web of transportation programs. We've talked about why this is important as we meet our climate change goals and so forth. But I also want to follow the lead of my friend Rod Diridon and get just a little bit political for just a moment at the outset. Because one of the things that I reflect on is that we make choices in a democracy. We choose what's important. Budgets are, in fact, expressions of our choices and our social values. And I have to tell you that last year I was invited back to my alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis, to talk about the California High-Speed Rail program to a number of classes of students and even some mid-career folks who were back there. And the day I got there, I got off the airplane and I met with these young students and I said, I have to tell you, as I stand here today, I'm angry. I'm very angry because on that day, the House of Representatives had voted for a $1.5 trillion tax cut. Now, I happen to be blessed to be part of the 1% in this country. I did not need a damn tax cut. And let's talk about what that choice was. $1.5 trillion was added to our federal deficit, of which 83% of the benefits went to people like me who didn't need them. The greatest proportion of those flowed through corporations which did what? Did they hire people? Not particularly. Did they invest in R&D? Not particularly. Most of it found its way into stock buybacks for immediate stock price increases. Here's a little known fact. What percentage of U.S. stock equities are owned by foreign nationals? 35%. So of the $1.5 trillion that we added to our children and our grandchildren's fiscal burden, we made the choice to flow that money into companies, into the hands of people who either A, didn't need it, or B, didn't live here. That's a hell of a choice to make. Let's talk about the choice we could have made. We could have, if we were going to add $1.5 trillion to the United States deficit, we could have built an entire national high-speed rail system. We could have rebuilt not just Flint's water supply, but we could have made sure that every community in America had at least secondary and possibly tertiary treatment systems for their waste treatment systems. We probably could have rebuilt all the schools in this country that we needed to do. And I'm angry that our political leaders, even in my party, did not stand up and clearly lay out for the American public what that choice actually meant. Now, we may have another opportunity to do that in the future, and I think that we should be ready. So I stand here as somebody who has been privileged to work on the nation's largest infrastructure project, as a person who believes in infrastructure. Why? Why is infrastructure important? The words kind of flow off your tongue, it's kind of easy, but we should think about it in a different way. And whenever I have these arguments, as I once did with Kevin McCarthy in Bakersfield, and they talk about the private sector and why is government doing this, they miss the point. If you look back at the history of America, at the reason we became the leading economic engine, if you look at the reason that China today is challenging us for that economic leadership, it is because governments at crucial times made critical investments in infrastructure, and then that provided a platform which allowed the genius and the initiative and the drive of the private sector to build off of that, to create wealth and opportunity for all our citizens. And at one point in that debate that I was having with Leader McCarthy, he said, well, look at this, down the road, down in Mojave, SpaceX is launching satellites, and the private sector is willing to launch satellites, but they're not willing to invest in high-speed rail. Well, what Mr. McCarthy didn't know was that my very first job out of college was at NASA. I spent 5 years there. And so I piped up and I said, well, you know something, Congressman? Probably the US taxpayers spent $500 billion on research labs, wind tunnels, launch facilities, R&D, before the private sector felt that they could step into that role. And this has been the way it's been since the Erie Canal, when the state of New York put up initial capital that allowed the creation of one of the first major transportation systems in this country, and the private sector came in and operated on it. This is the way that the Transcontinental Railroad was built, with the federal government providing low-interest loans, every other section of land, all those incentives, and the private sector came in and built the railroads. This is the way it was with our air traffic control system. Boeing didn't build the air traffic control system, but Boeing was able to build airplanes to fly us all over the place because we have a safe and efficient system for doing that. And this is the way it's been for Silicon Valley, because even though Al Gore did not invent the internet, as he's been widely misquoted as saying, Al Gore, as a member of the United States Senate, saw the potential of ARPANET, a communications tie-in between our research labs and our federal facilities, and said, this could be something more. And with all due respect, although they could do it today, Apple and Google did not make the investment in that initial system. They could not have done that. So part of what I think what we need to do is to remind people what it is that actually does move the country forward. It is a critical strategic investment by our country in the underlying infrastructure that then allows other things to grow and blossom. And this is a conversation that I think if we can get past the point in American politics where we're all yelling at each other, that we ought to be able to sit down and have. And I tell people all the time, I'm not so much of a true believer in high-speed rail in the pejorative sense of the word. High-speed rail is a tool. It's a tool. A hammer's a tool. A hammer can build a house. A hammer can be used to hit somebody over the head. It's how you use that tool that is important. For us in California, high-speed rail is a tool that can do many, many, many wonderful things. We can invest in underinvested areas. We can tie our communities together. We can free up freight rail capacity. We can meet our climate change goals because, as was pointed out by Rod this morning, since California's already cleaned up its electric generating system, the biggest sector that contributes to carbon in other states, in our state, it's transportation. And we need to electrify the transportation system, and high-speed rail is the backbone of that. On the other hand, we have to be careful. If we're not careful, that wonderful connection between workers in Silicon Valley and affordable homes in California could, if we're not careful, lead to urban sprawl in the Central Valley. It could lead to further loss of ag land. It could lead to other kinds of social dislocations. It could lead to very rich people here deciding, oh, hey, I could have a 5-acre ranchette in the Central Valley and be to work in 40 minutes. So we can't just rely on the goodness of our technology. We've got to do more. We've got to think about this in a broader, systemic way. So what I'd like to propose is a couple things. First, number one, we need a national conversation about infrastructure, its historic importance and its future importance. As we set that as a context, then I think we can have the conversation about transportation infrastructure, of which high-speed rail is a critical key piece. And I'm very proud of the fact that when we came in, I think we picked up on the theme that Rod had been trying to propose and talk about, which is that high-speed rail was not some insular, standalone system, but in fact a critical spinal part of a system of rail modernization and improvement throughout. And like Rod, I had served on a local transit board or had been involved in local transit development, so I understood that just as he understands that in his bones. So we need to have a national conversation about infrastructure. We need to have a conversation about transportation and the role of high-speed rail in that. Now, I'm a guy who's spent a lot of time in politics, and I try to understand what it takes to move arguments, move people. And the one thing that I've learned in this complex age is that nothing gets done without coalitions. I mean, virtually nothing gets accomplished in the state legislature or the national legislature without coalitions. We need to have broad and deep relationships with others. And those are not going to be easy to forge in some cases. We have some people who either don't see the connection or sometimes might see competition. The railroads, for example. You would not think that the freight railroads should be our allies, but they should be our allies. And I had an opportunity to say that to the head of Union Pacific. He was in Fresno to try to do something about the decline in the share of movement of goods and services out of the Central Valley that were going by rail. Now, just a little side note here. In the Central Valley of California, the air quality is very bad because it is a valley, it's got mountains on both sides, the air gets trapped there. The result of this, from the agricultural operations, from diesel truck emissions, is that 21% of the children in the Central Valley of California have asthma. 1 out of every 5. I would submit that nobody should be comfortable with that. A big reason for that is so much of the produce moves by truck. The share of fruits and vegetables from the Central Valley moved by rail had fallen from 46% to 6%. I don't know why, but it had. But one contributing factor was the popularity of passenger rail in the Central Valley. The San Joaquin's Amtrak line is the 5th busiest Amtrak route in the United States. The Sacramento Valley Station in Sacramento, which is modest to say the least, is the 7th busiest Amtrak station in the US. This is kind of a surprising fact. But I said, well, Fritz, I said, Lance, you should be for our project. And he said, why is that? I said, because people here want passenger rail, and the passenger rail cars are competing with you for freight rail capacity. We're building a brand new, standalone, passenger-only system. We will move passenger traffic off of your freight lines onto our lines. That will allow you to have more efficient freight movement and allow you to recapture that share of your market, which also, by the way, will benefit the environment and everything else. Hadn't thought of it. Never occurred to him. So the railroads should be our allies, not just here, but across the country. Amtrak is generally operating outside the Northeast Corridor on track owned by private railroad companies. That means if we're pushing passenger rail, we're competing against freight rail. Why are we doing that when we can build a brand new parallel system? The environmental community has not been as much of our allies as they really should be. Why is that? Fear of technology, lack of understanding of what this really means? I don't know. But we need to forge those relationships, and I think they're very important. The obvious choice of the high technology community here, but in other parts of the country, makes a lot of sense. And, you know, let me just also divert for a moment. One thing that makes me absolutely crazy is when you go to talk to somebody in the high-tech community and they say, well, you know, you guys are talking about like 19th century technology, rail. I mean, you know, it's not cool, it's not hip, it's not all this. So I've come up with this little riff. I said, well, so a Tesla is exactly like a 57 Chevy, right? And I said, what are you talking about? I said, isn't a Tesla the same technology as a 57 Chevy? Rubber tires, runs on fixed guideways? No, of course not. Tesla has aerodynamic body design, it's computer controlled, and it has an electric propulsion system. Right, so let's compare a high-speed rail train with an Amtrak train or a steam locomotive. High-speed rail train has aerodynamic body, computer controls, and a new highly efficient electric propulsion system. This is not an ancient technology. The Japanese are on their 5th, 6th generation of trains. The original bullet train in 1964, opened for the Olympics, went 135 miles an hour. That was the bullet train. The new trains go 235 miles an hour. This technology keeps moving forward, whether it's aerodynamics or noise control or whatever. So we need to reach out to the tech community. We need to tell them this is a high technology, exciting, evolving thing that you guys should be behind. for a whole bunch of reasons. Not just because it helps your workers, but because it creates a brand new technology manufacturing base in the United States that you'll contribute to and you'll be part of. And there are other allies as well. And I think that in the smart growth community, working with builders and others, people like Peter Calthorpe who see, new urbanists who see the benefit of high density environments and what that could mean for protection of land use and livability, they should be our allies as well. So I would just say to you, as I've been given this honor by Rod and asked to step into this, and with the opportunity to work with Andy and the leadership team, and those of you who were on the advisory committee and other friends of high-speed rail, let's dedicate ourselves to be ready when the environment is right, to make the arguments why infrastructure is critical to this country, why high-speed rail and transportation is part of that, and why we are changing lives and will reshape the future of the country by moving this technology forward in the right way, in a thoughtful way, but in an aggressive way. Thank you again for this honor and the chance to be here today.